Hey folks, Dale Davidson, Dear VA Guy. Thank you for tuning in today. Question: do you know how many different chemicals and toxins that you are exposed to each and every day? Interesting, right? For men, it's about 126. For women, it's about 168. But what if you were in the U.S. military? Well, guess what? I couldn't find anything that could give me any kind of quantitative numbers as to how many chemicals our service men and women are exposed to each and every day. But hey, today we're talking about the toxic legacy of Fort McClellan over there in Alabama and what you need to know. Now, just because I'm talking about Fort McClellan doesn't mean it doesn't apply to you, because there are hundreds of U.S. military bases out there. If you served in the military, I am quite sure that you were probably exposed to some toxins and some chemicals that you need to be careful about. So let's dive in. So Fort McClellan is over in Anniston, Alabama, and that was a training ground for America's armed forces. Hosted the U.S. Army Chemical Training or Chemical Corps School, the military police, the MPs, and other countless service members. Okay, and they lived on and off base, of course, like everywhere. Of course, it was backed up to the town of Anniston. Now, the VA currently states there are no health conditions that are presumptively service-connected to veterans who served at Fort McClellan, even though it's a toxic waste dump. Okay, so in other words, if you served there, or any military base, okay, that if you serve there and there's no presumptive condition, you just have some extra hoops you got to jump through. So you'd have to show exposure, show you have a disease, and show the nexus, the link between your disease and your service exposure. It's just a little bit more that you got to jump through. Of course, we've got the PACT Act out there that if that were to apply, which unfortunately doesn't, then we have some presumptives. We don't have presumptives here. Okay. So you remember Erin Brockovich, right? So she was in the movie, and there was a movie about her, and it's played by Julia Roberts, and she won an Oscar and a Golden Globe for her role. It was a pretty good movie, okay? So she was a paralegal and a consumer advocate who helped build a case against Pacific Gas and Electric, okay, regarding some contamination for Hinckley, California. And they won, hundreds of millions of dollars for their plaintiffs in that case. But she continues her advocacy today. The point of that story is, look, we need everyone who's listening to this to become an Erin Brockovich with relate to these toxic military bases. Contact your senator, your House representative, and continue to push for health registries, not only for Fort McClellan, but whatever base you served on if you were exposed to toxins and chemicals, okay? If you were exposed and those chemicals are detrimental to your health, why not put them on some kind of presumptive exposure list? So we're going to dive into the different chemicals at Fort McClellan and why they should probably be on why Fort McClellan should be on the presumptive list. So during your lifetime, you probably heard about PCBs. There's a big long name that I'm not going to even try to pronounce. Okay, but PCBs were used in electrical transformers, and then hydraulic systems and paints and sealants and all that. But in 1970, they were banned. And Monsanto, the big chemical company, was the one who was the largest producer of PCB products. Okay, and so this contamination spread like wildfire through the Anniston community. Okay, now Anniston, Alabama backs up to Fort McClellan. Okay, it's still toxic, but it's residual risk, what they call. That doesn't mean it's safe. Those PCBs are still present. So if you were exposed to PCBs, what do you got to do? What kind of diseases are we looking at here? Common health issues, cancers, linked to PCBs include liver toxicity, fatty liver disease, thyroid problems, immune system suppression like ITP, chloracne, and skin rashes, developmental and reproductive issues. You've got liver cancer, bile tract cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and melanomas. All of those things are linked to PCBs. So if you have any of those, then again, let's figure out what your MOS at Fort McClellan was, or whatever base you're at, and let's link your exposure to your medical condition through medical evidence. So what other agents were there at Fort McClellan, and probably at the base that you were stationed at? They're chemical warfare agents, okay? So again, I said earlier that the U.S. Army Chemical Corps school was there for decades, okay? And they were trained in chemical decontamination, protective equipment, and all that kind of good stuff. So what kind of typical exposures did you have? Remember those old World War I movies? Mustard gas, okay? It's a blistering agent. Maybe you were exposed to that. There's all kinds of arsenic-based chemicals that you might have been exposed to, and some other decontamination chemicals. So what are some of the known health impacts as it relates to some of those chemical warfare agents, okay? Maybe you had some kind of chronic respiratory condition, airway scarring because of the mustard gas, skin blistering, scarring, eye irritation. Maybe your DNA was damaged all the way down to some kind of cellular mutation. I don't know. We'd have to get doctors to tell us that. Maybe you have some kind of neurological impairment from nerve agent exposure. Of course, we've got the cancers, the lung cancer, the throat cancers, skin cancers, all of those kinds of things. They are linked to these chemical warfare agents. We need to, if you're experiencing those, we need to get that link with respect to medical evidence. We need to get that link for your service connection. Radiological materials, okay, so they hosted radiological training, okay, isotopes, okay, and cobalt, all of those bad things, okay. So even though they were probably low dosages, that still causes cancer. I mean, so think about it. If you go to the dentist and you are having teeth x-rays, but they sit there and take x-ray after x-ray after, so you're constantly being bombarded by radiology and those isotopes and whatever is included in all that. That's going to be harmful to your health. If you were exposed there, they might have been little or limited in amounts, but the constant exposure kind of wears on your body over a period of time. So what are some common health conditions associated with radiation exposure? There's thyroid disorders and thyroid cancer. There's leukemias and other blood cancers. There's bone and lung cancers, cataracts, heart disease, fertility issues, all those kinds of things, genetic mutations, all of those things that if you were exposed to radiation could have an impact on your health or the impact of your children. Now, PFAS. Again, that's a big long name. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But they call these the forever chemicals. These are like the firefighting foams. You probably heard advertisements for these plaintiffs' firms about firefighting foam and water repellents, okay? They resist degrading. They last, okay? And they accumulate in your blood and in your organs. So I know a guy, his name is Daniel Root. Google him, and he's all about trying to help people get rid of these toxins and metals in their blood. But check him out. So, but these PFASs, these forever chemicals, stay in your blood and your system forever. And these chemicals have been detected in the soil and groundwater in and around Fort McClellan. So what kind of health conditions are we looking at? Well, there's kidney and testicular cancers, there's liver diseases, elevated liver enzymes, immune suppressions, thyroid dysfunction. Well, the thyroid's involved in a whole lot of things, right? And then there's pregnancy complications, increased cholesterol, hypertension, all of those things. So those forever chemicals have a really detrimental, long-lasting effect on your health and well-being. Well, what are other hazards? VOCs, heavy metals. We talked about the burn pits under the PACT Act. Now, burn pits are over in the Middle East, but I'm quite sure Fort McClellan had burn pits. Okay, so if they had burn pits there and you were exposed, then you got some volatile organic compounds, VOCs, heavy metals, and all of those things that you were exposed to through just breathing in the air. I mean, you didn't have to do anything except for breathe around those burn pits or around Fort McClellan to ingest those chemicals. So, what kind of health concerns are we looking at here? Again, kidney, bladder, liver cancers, chronic bronchitis, COPD, neurological disorders, Parkinson's disease, autoimmune diseases, birth defects, and fertility problems. All of those are related to these VOCs, heavy metals, and things like that from other hazards that you may have been in contact with at Fort McClellan or again at whatever base you were stationed at. So, what do you need to do? Well, get prepared, because here we go. So I told you that exposure to the chemicals at Fort McClellan, you're not on a presumptive list. So we don't get to skip any steps here. We got to go through the whole step of disease and linking your disease to your service, okay? So how do you protect yourself and how do you strengthen your claim? Document your service dates, unit assignments, and specific training areas. If you were involved in radiology, contamination, and storage or whatever, document that. Document if you were on bivouac and you were drinking out of canteens that says, hey, just pop a iodine tablet in there and you'll be good. Because look, we all know that the groundwater there is contaminated. Give us the story. A strong statement from you goes a long way. Get your full medical and service records from the VA and the National Archives. I mean, ask for every scrap of paper. Here's a key. Undergo a complete medical evaluation for cancers, endocrine, and immune disorders. That means a complete blood makeup. Now, I'm telling you, when you go to the doctor, your doctor's going to just order the routine blood test. But if you go to the doctor and say, Doctor, I think I was exposed to PCBs. I want you to do the blood test that would see if I still have that in my systems, or VOCs or toxic metals or whatever. The blood test, urine test, whatever, they have those tests nowadays that can help determine that. That will go a long way towards your nexus, connecting your service to your disease and your injury. After you get all your medical evaluation done, file the claim referencing your exposure and request inclusion into the Fort McClellan exposure studies. These studies are ongoing. They're trying to figure out, I guess eventually maybe they might have a presumptive list for Fort McClellan. I don't know. Hopefully they will. But it doesn't hurt to ask to be within those studies. So look, the toxic history of Fort McClellan is vast. So we have to have a comprehensive investigation, and constant advocacy is essential. That's why I said everybody needs to be an Aaron Brockovich, not only for Fort McClellan, but for all veterans who may have been exposed wherever they were. From PCBs to PFASs to all these overlapping exposures, they likely affected you. I've done this in previous videos. I have a client who has a chronic illness and has been denied over and over again because Fort McClellan is not yet a presumptive site for toxic exposure. But it's up to us to continue to find persistent, documented advocacy can bridge the gap. And that's what we're doing for that veteran. So look, if you served at Fort McClellan or wherever you served, okay, and you have a health condition that's potentially linked to exposure from chemicals or burn pits, or even if you weren't in the Middle East, radiation, any kind of toxic exposure, if you believe you were exposed, get your ducks in a row. Get your complete medical evaluation for whatever condition you think. Let's figure out what you were exposed to and make sure that it's in your medical records. Just because we don't have the presumption doesn't mean you can't file. We can file, but you have got to have that link, that nexus in between your service and your exposure that caused the disease. But for my exposure to PCBs at Fort McClellan, I would not have this thyroid cancer or whatever it may be. So look, I want to stress to you, just because we're not on the presumptive list, we're not down and out, okay? Service connection is still possible. It's a little bit more complicated than a presumption, but it can still be done. So your ongoing medical issues, they change over time. Just like the ongoing medical issues with all of those veterans out there that were exposed, they're changing the landscape in the future. So if the Fort McClellan studies or whatever study that you're involved in reveal specific conditions, they could lead to a new presumptive list down the road. So keep up the good work. Hey folks, thank you for tuning in today. Look, I love my veterans, love my veterans' families, and I hope this was very informative for you. So hey, look, check out this video about the most toxic military bases. There's over 100 of them. Until next time, be blessed.